Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father served in the Czechoslovak army in the United Kingdom during the Second World War, but before the war started, he was a famous boxing champion. Could you tell us more about his boxing past?
Yes, as I understand it, he was always a very sporty boy and encouraged to be so by his father. He was a gymnast and an amateur boxer, but I believe my grandfather had an injury in the First World War and his health became increasingly fragile. And in order to provide for the family, my father was advised that he would make money if he became a professional. And he became a professional boxer and champion of Czechoslovakia and Austria. Welterweight, and he was a contender for the European title. He fought Marcel Cerdan, who was Edith Piaf's lover, but sadly didn't beat him. And I think there would have been another match, but the Second World War intervened, and obviously after the war he didn't box.
Before the war he was even married to...
Oh, he was married to Luba Romanova. Yes. There is a rather lovely story that when my parents eventually arrived back in Prague after the war, Luba was there to meet them, and with a great big bunch of red roses, which she presented to my father, who of course turned round and gave them to my mother.
After the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, he fled to France.
Yes.
How did he manage to escape?
By going into Gestapo headquarters. Remember, he was blonde, a famous sportsman, and spoke perfect German because he was brought up in Vienna. Thumped his fist on the counter and said, in German obviously, "Is this an example of German efficiency? I have a fight in Paris, I need a passport." "Yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir," and he got a passport. Unfortunately, he then turned up in Paris with a Nazi passport, but fortunately there were people in Paris who were able to vouch for him. He went into the French Foreign Legion for a while. Mm-hmm. He didn't actually need to because he was living in Paris immediately before the war, but because everybody else was going, he went too. And then after France was invaded, the French released the legionnaires to their own armies.
After moving to England, he went on a series of boxing exhibitions.
Oh, was
he famous here?
I think he was known, but not famous. I think in the boxing world he was known, but not to the general public because he'd never fought in England. He had been injured in the battle for France. There'd been a blast injury which had detached his retina. And if your retina is detached, you're supposed to lie down in a sort of darkened room for 3 days, but he drove a motorbike to the south of France. And of course, although he knew that his sight was a bit dodgy, he didn't tell anybody, and therefore he did the boxing. He was hit in the eye because he wasn't really seeing, I think. And from there, the eye became infected, and that's how he met my mother at Castlemead. My parents met at Castlemead. When my father arrived from Cholmondeley, his eye was dressed and my mother was detailed to remove the dressing. It was so unpleasant that she was really nearly sick, but came to appreciate him more in later times. This is my mother with other nurses from Castlemead and the Chelsea pensioners who shared the accommodation with the Czechs.
He lost his eye?
Yes, yes, it had to be removed. This is my father with me. He didn't wear the eye patch in the end, except if he thought he would be under stress. I thought everybody's parents had false eyes.
After the war, he returned to Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
And what did he do?
After he lost his eye, he worked for the Czech government in London for Beneš. And then because he had lost an eye and there was fears for his other eye, he trained as a physiotherapist because that was a career that you could pursue if you were blind. And he trained at the Royal Homeopathic Hospital in London. Mm-hmm. So after the war, when he went back with my mother to Czechoslovakia, he worked in the spa town of Teplice doing rehabilitation. And he had a very good friend in Teplice. She was asked to help an English lady with her Czech. And when she turned up and found that the English lady was my father's wife, she was absolutely bowled over.
Did he like this job?
Oh, he loved it. He loved it. He had an ambition to be a doctor in his youth. His father's illness prevented him pursuing his studies.
After the communist coup in 1948, he escaped back to England?
Yes, my mother left for a holiday, having got permission, and so she had to leave my father not knowing when she would see him again. My father did get permission to go with a boxing team to Austria, and the story goes he was buying everybody drinks in the bar. That's the night before he left, and in the morning he was absent from the hotel and they didn't know where he was. And he claimed asylum or whatever the system was in that. But he was stuck then in Austria because he couldn't get permission to come to England. He was in Austria for about 9 months. My mother did write to the then Queen explaining the situation. She, of course, wrote back, and we have the letter, to say that she couldn't help, but she would pass it on to the authorities. It was interesting that he got permission to come very shortly afterwards, so maybe she did help. This is the letter from the private secretary to the Queen after my mother had written to her asking for help to get my father to England from Austria. This money was the money he had in his pocket when he left Czechoslovakia. Now, these are the documentation for entry to the United Kingdom after the war. You can see how different he was by then. And he is, of course, described as stateless. He came and eventually got a job, actually quite quickly, as a physiotherapist in a practice in Cambridge for, I suppose, about 3 years. And then he got a job in the new health service in a hospital in Slough and worked in general physio practice there. And his final job was in a school for cerebrally palsied children, where he was the physiotherapist. That's the school for cerebrally palsied children.
And what about your mother?
Well, my mother, when she first got back to England, not knowing when she would see my father again, got a job because she had worked in a quite senior position for somebody who was a young woman in Slough. And she worked until my father joined her and they went to Cambridge. Then she didn't work. She stayed at home looking after us. My parents bought into the notion that having left their home and left everything, that wasn't the most important thing. The important thing was being in a family. After my sister went to secondary school, she started working as a secretary and worked as a secretary in a junior school for many years.
You became a teacher of sociology and politics?
Yes, eventually.
Why did you choose these?
Oh, well, I went to university originally to study science. It was 1965 and I was feeling a bit revolutionary. And so I dropped out of science and did a degree in sociology and never intended to teach. I worked for a charity that supported cerebrally palsied children, and then I had my children and needed to find a job that would fit round having children at the time, and so I became a teacher, and having a degree in sociology, I taught sociology, mostly sociology and politics.
Later you moved into charity work.
Yes, I was paid, but not very much. I worked for a mental health charity. I managed a small mental health charity in Croydon. And then when I finally retired, I decided to be a Pilates teacher, which was returning to my interest in dance and ballet. Well, I believe I know I started ballet at 3. My father had been a friend of the ballet mistress at the National Theatre in Prague. And I continued till I was 18, but it wasn't going to be the career that I would have liked it to be, and therefore I went to university and studied.
Did your father and his Czech background have a big influence in your life?
Yes, I think a very serious influence. I think it's made me very aware of European history. Many people in the United Kingdom have a very island, if you like, view of Europe. But I think if you come from the centre of Europe, you have an awareness of the political processes and power differentials in the whole of Europe. And of course it's also made me capable of making a reasonable knedlíky.